Ethan Graves stepped onto his porch, coffee in one hand, and stopped cold. A bright red envelope was taped to his front door. Notice of violation, stamped in bold, self-important lettering. He exhaled through his nose, taking a slow sip of coffee, before peeling it off the wood. The paper was crisp, high quality, probably printed on the kind of expensive cardstock that screamed, "I take myself too seriously." He scanned the letter. "Dear homeowner, you are in direct violation of Oak Ridge HOA guidelines. Immediate compliance is required to avoid penalties. Fine, $250. Failure to maintain property." Aesthetics. Ethan frowned and glanced at his yard. Freshly cut grass. Driveway clean. No rusted cars on cinder blocks. So what the hell was he failing to maintain? His house wasn't even in the HOA. He snorted and crumpled the notice in one hand, tossing it into the bin by the door. Nice try. Then another letter arrived the next day. Then another. By the end of the week, his mailbox looked like a junk drawer for HOA citations, fines for unauthorized exterior modifications, excessive noise complaints, failure to submit a landscaping plan. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so damn persistent. By the second week, Ethan didn't even bother reading them, just tore them up and went about his day. That's when the threat started. A final notice arrived. The language was sharp, aggressive, legalese wrapped around carefully chosen words like mandatory compliance and escalated action. Ethan sighed, leaned against his truck, and read it under the dim glow of his porch light. A breeze carried the distant hum of crickets. That's when he noticed it. A silhouette at the end of his driveway. He straightened, eyes narrowing. Victoria. Langston, blonde, polished, and standing like she owned the damn street. She wasn't on his property, but she wanted him to know she was watching. Clipboard in hand, she checked her gold wristwatch as if he was late for an appointment he never agreed to. Ethan let the silence stretch before finally speaking. "See something you like?" Victoria's lips curled into a smile, the kind that corporate sharks wore before a hostile takeover. "I was hoping to catch you." Ethan folded his arms. "Congratulations. You did." She stepped closer, heels clicking against pavement, and pulled a sheet from her clipboard. "Another violation. I wanted to personally remind you about the outstanding fines on your property." He barely glanced at the paper. "Not part of your HOA, sweetheart." Her smile didn't waver. "Well," she said, voice sugared with condescension, "Oak Ridge Estates has certain expectations for the surrounding community. It's only fair that everyone contributes." Ethan let out a sharp laugh. "Fair?" She tilted her head. "You wouldn't want to make things difficult for yourself." His jaw tightened. "That a threat?" Victoria gave a soft, amused laugh. "Of course not. Just a friendly reminder that this community values cooperation." Ethan took a slow step forward, voice dropping lower. "And here's a reminder for you. Slap another fake fine on my door and I'll file a harassment complaint. You can play queen of the HOA all you want, but you don't have a damn bit of authority over me." For a fraction of a second, her mask slipped. A tiny crack in the perfect facade. Then, just as fast, she smoothed it over and adjusted her blazer. "I do hope you reconsider." And with that, she turned and walked back down his driveway, disappearing into the night. Ethan watched her go, shaking his head. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Ethan Graves had dealt with killers, fugitives, and cartel hit squads. But HOA politics? Apparently that was where the real war was fought. It started with small things, a bag of garbage dumped onto his lawn. Nothing major. Could have been a mistake. Until it happened again. And again. Then came the mailbox. Ethan found it lying face down one morning, wood splintered like it had been kicked over. He fixed it, but the next day, same thing. By the third time, he left it broken. If someone wanted to send him a message, he got it. Then, one night, he walked out to his truck and saw 4 tires slashed. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps out the channel. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. He crouched, fingers running along the cuts. Clean, deliberate. A knife, not random vandalism. Rex, his German shepherd, sniffed the air beside him, ears twitching. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Ethan exhaled through his nose, calm but calculating. This wasn't just HOA nonsense anymore. This was personal. At first, Ethan ignored the whispers, neighbors giving him sideways glances. Conversations cut, short when he walked by. Then it got worse. At the gas station, an old-timer named Jim Carter shook his head as Ethan filled up his spare truck. "Hope you get things sorted out soon." Ethan frowned. "Sorted out?" Jim sighed. "Victoria's been talking, says you've got legal trouble, that you're one of those problem homeowners who refuses to pay dues. Even mentioned a warrant." Ethan blinked. A warrant. That was new. Jim patted his shoulder. "You know how she is. HOA politics." Ethan muttered a curse under his breath as Jim drove off. This wasn't politics. This was a smear campaign. Victoria wasn't just trying to fine him into submission. She was turning the entire neighborhood against him. And the next morning, he found out just how far she was willing to go. He was sipping coffee on his porch when a sleek black SUV pulled into his driveway. Victoria Langston stepped out, heels clicking. That same plastic smile plastered across her face. Ethan didn't get up, just took another sip of coffee. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Victoria folded her arms. "I thought we should talk face to face. That what you were doing last night? Talking? Or slashing tires?" She chuckled. "You're being dramatic. Mr. Graves." Ethan leaned forward. "And you're testing my patience." Victoria sighed, pulling out a thick manila envelope. She handed it to him. "We held a vote," she said. Ethan frowned, opening the packet. Inside was a formal declaration from the HOA board. Effective immediately, 1437 Willow Lane is hereby integrated into Oak Ridge HOA regulations. His jaw flexed. They were trying to force him into their control. He let out a slow breath. "That's cute," Victoria smirked. "Not cute, legal." Ethan closed the folder. "No, Victoria, it's not." She held her smile, but he saw it. That tiny flicker of doubt in her eyes. Good. He stood, stepping off the porch, closing the distance between them. Victoria held her ground, but he saw her grip tighten on her clipboard. "Push any further," Ethan said, voice low, "and you're gonna regret it." Her jaw clenched. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. Ethan held her gaze, unblinking. Then finally she turned, stepping back into her SUV. The engine rumbled to life, and she rolled down the window. Eyes cold. "This isn't over." "Mr. Graves?" Ethan smirked, tilting his head. "No, Victoria, it's just getting started." The letter was waiting for him when he stepped outside. A thick, official-looking envelope taped neatly to his front door, right where the last dozen HOA violations had been. But this time, it wasn't marked "Final Notice." This one had something better. Ethan Graves took his time peeling it off the door, rolling his shoulders as he opened it. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind lawyers use to make bad news look important. His eyes skimmed the first few lines. "Dear Mr. Graves, failure to comply with HOA regulations has resulted in legal action. An active warrant has been issued. For your arrest, you are hereby required to submit to HOA enforcement officers upon request. Failure to do so will result in escalated penalties. Signed, Victoria Langston, President, Oak Ridge HO." Ethan blinked. Then he laughed. A real, genuine, deep belly laugh. He read it again just to be sure. Yep. This lunatic actually thought she could issue an arrest warrant. A real warrant had a judge's signature, a case number, a legal jurisdiction. This had a woman with a clipboard and a god complex. Victoria must have hoped he was dumb enough to buy it, or desperate enough. He ran his thumb along the paper, flipping it over, holding it up to the sunlight. The formatting was too polished, too corporate. Someone had spent real money to make this look official, and that made his jaw tighten. Victoria was going all in. He should have expected this. The fines, the rumors, the harassment. Those were just tests now? She was playing for keeps, and the real question wasn't how far she'd go, it was who was backing her. Ethan set the paper down on his kitchen table, running a hand over his jaw. Victoria had overplayed her hand. Because one thing didn't make sense. She shouldn't know his background. A normal HOA president wouldn't try this against just anyone, but against a U.S. Marshal? That was suicide, and Yet here she was trying to put him in cuffs. Either she was stupid, or someone had tipped her off. Ethan exhaled slowly, staring at the letter like it might answer him. He could have shut it down immediately, called her, filed a real legal complaint, ended this whole thing before it got worse. But why do that? Why shut it down now, when she was digging herself deeper? No. He wasn't going to react. Not yet. He was going to let her think she was winning, because when she finally went too far, that's when he'd bury her. The knock came at exactly 9 UAS a.m., sharp, authoritative, 3 evenly spaced thuds against wood. The kind of knock that said, "We mean business." Ethan Graves took his time setting down his coffee. He already knew who it was. He swung the door open and took in the sight. 2 men stood on his porch, dressed in matching black uniforms with shiny metal badges pinned to their chests. They had the look. Cheap tactical boots, utility belts loaded with absolutely nothing useful, and the stiff-backed posture of men who had spent more time watching cop dramas than actually being in law enforcement. The taller one, Brian Tate, squared his shoulders like he was about to announce a drug bust on primetime television. The shorter one, Oliver Dunn, was gripping a clipboard like it was a lifeline. Ethan folded his arms. "Morning, gentlemen." Brian's jaw flexed. "Are you Ethan Graves?" Ethan smirked. "That depends. You here to sell me solar panels, or tell me my car's warranty expired?" Brian's face barely twitched. "We're with the Oak Ridge HOA Law Enforcement Division." Ethan's smile widened. "Oh, this was gonna be fun." Oliver cleared his throat. "Sir, we have an active warrant for your arrest." Ethan made a show of looking between the two of them. "A warrant?" He put a hand over his chest. "For me?" Brian's hand drifted toward his belt, where a real officer would have had a holster. Ethan clocked it immediately. No gun, no cuffs, just cheap intimidation. Brian stepped forward. "Per HOA code violations, you've repeatedly failed to comply with community regulations and have accrued significant fines. You need to come with us." Ethan let the silence stretch. Then he whistled low. "Wow, a whole arrest squad. The HOA must really be hurting for dues." Oliver shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flicked toward Brian. This wasn't going how they expected. Brian doubled down. "This isn't a joke, sir. If you resist, we'll have to escalate." Ethan tilted. His head. "Escalate how?" Brian hesitated. "We'll detain you." That did it. Ethan grinned, slow and dangerous. He reached into his back pocket, pulling out a badge. Not cheap plastic, not Amazon-purchased nonsense, but a real U.S. Marshal badge. He flipped it open between 2 fingers and held it up, and watched. As both men went pale, Ethan let the moment hang, let them feel it. Then he spoke, voice casual. "Gentlemen, you just attempted to detain a federal officer." Oliver took a full step back. The clipboard slipped from his fingers, hitting the porch, with a sad little slap. "Brian?" Brian froze, his jaw clenched. His eyes darted to Ethan's badge, then back to his face, like he was trying to mentally reboot. Ethan tilted his head. "So, let's clear a few things up. First, where exactly is your jurisdiction?" Silence. "Second," he continued, stepping forward, "would you like to be charged with impersonating law enforcement before or after I run your names?" Oliver snapped. He turned and bolted. Full-on sprint down the driveway, across the street, gone. Brian didn't run, but he didn't fight either. Ethan could see the gears turning in his head. The slow realization that this wasn't just a failed HOA shakedown. This was a felony waiting to happen. Ethan held his stare for a long beat. Then, just to twist the knife, he smiled. "Run along, Brian, before I change my mind." Brian didn't need to be told twice. He backed up, turned, and walked. Fast. Ethan stood there watching them disappear. He could have stopped them. Could have called the sheriff's office right then and there. But he didn't. Because these two, they weren't the real problem. They were just foot soldiers. And Ethan had bigger prey to catch. Ethan Graves sat in his dimly lit office, fingers drumming against his desk. The glow from his laptop screen cast sharp shadows across his face. He had 2 names, Brian Tate, Oliver Dunn. Not real cops, not even licensed security. just two idiots playing dress-up. But Ethan had learned something a long time ago. Follow the grunts, and they'll lead you straight to the kingpin. He cracked his knuckles and started digging. It didn't take long to pull their records. Brian Tate, ex-bounty hunter with a record of excessive force complaints, lost his license after roughing up the wrong guy. Debt-ridden, desperate. The perfect attack dog. Oliver Dunn, former rent-a-cop, bounced from mall security to private patrols. No criminal record, but plenty of questionable conduct reports. A pawn. But the real kicker, they weren't the only ones. There were at least a dozen others. Each of them was listed under a private security firm. But that firm didn't exist. No state records. No licensing. Just a shell company with one connection. The Oak Ridge HOA. Ethan exhaled slowly, scrolling through public records. Over the last 4 years, multiple homeowners had lost their properties due to outstanding HOA fines. But these weren't normal violations. These were deliberate setups. Step 1. Harass the homeowner, stack up fines, overwhelm them with legal threats. Step 2. Send in the HOA enforcement to intimidate them. Step 3. If they still didn't pay, their property was seized, and every single seizure had been signed off by the same judge, Judge Alan Prescott. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rolling his tongue against his teeth. Victoria Langston wasn't just running an HOA, she was running a racket. He pulled up the financials, multiple bank accounts. But the biggest transfers weren't staying in the HOA's hands. Massive sums were being funneled offshore. Ethan clicked through encrypted banking records, tracing the trail. It all led to one name, Graham Lockwood, a real estate mogul with ties to private development firms, political lobbying, and a history of unusual property acquisitions. And suddenly, it all made sense. Victoria wasn't just a power-hungry HOA tyrant. She was a puppet. And now, Ethan wasn't just up against a corrupt HOA. He was up against something much, much bigger. Ethan Graves had walked into plenty of ambushes before, some with guns, some with knives. But this was the first time he had ever been lured into a sham courtroom run by a power-hungry HOA president with a god complex. He pulled into the parking lot of a rented conference hall, the kind that usually hosted real estate seminars or overpriced wedding receptions. The sign out front read, Oak Ridge HOA, Mandatory Arbitration Hearing. Ethan smirked. Mandatory. Cute. He adjusted his jacket, checked the weight of his badge in his pocket, and stepped inside. The room was exactly what he expected, a long conference table at the center, cheap folding chairs. A projector set up like this was an actual legal proceeding. And at the head of the table, Victoria Langston. She was dressed for courtroom theater, blazer sharp, hair perfect, gavel resting beside her like she actually had the authority to use it. 2 other homeowners sat nervously across from her, middle-aged, stiff-backed, clutching folders full of HOA violation notices. Victoria glanced up as Ethan walked in, and she smiled, that same predatory grin she had worn in his driveway. Mr. Graves, I'm glad you decided to be reasonable. Ethan slid into a chair, one arm draped over the backrest. Let's call it curiosity. Victoria folded her hands over the table. I assume you're here to settle your outstanding fines? Ethan exhaled through his nose, glancing around the room. 2 men stood near the door. Muscle, dressed in plain black polos. HOA enforcers, or at least what was left of them. Brian and Oliver were still licking their wounds from the last encounter. But these 2, they were here to make sure no one left without signing. Ethan turned back to Victoria. You know, Victoria, I've been wondering something. She arched a perfectly sculpted brow. Oh? Ethan leaned forward, hands clasped. When exactly are your officers supposed to arrive? Victoria's smile faltered. Not much. Just a flicker. But Ethan saw it. She was expecting reinforcements. She was stalling. And that's when Ethan heard it. The distinct sound of tires screeching outside. Then, the doors burst open. Uniformed officers poured into the room. Badges flashed. Hands on holsters. The 2 hired enforcers barely had time to react before they were shoved against the wall and cuffed. One of the homeowners let out a breathless, "Oh, thank God." Victoria? She shot to her feet. What is the meaning of this? Ethan pulled out his own badge, flipping it open between 2 fingers. It means, Victoria, that your little court is officially closed for business." Her face went pale. Not fear, anger. She clenched her fists, eyes darting to the exit. No way out. The trap had sprung. Ethan stood, tucking his badge back into his pocket. "Now, why don't we talk about that offshore account of yours?" Victoria Langston was still screaming. "When they cuffed her, 'This is illegal. I have immunity. You have no idea who you're dealing with.'" Ethan Graves watched from across the room, arms crossed, unimpressed. The rented conference hall was a crime scene now. Officers were hauling away evidence, flipping through HOA financials, pulling records that would bury Victoria 6 feet under a legal nightmare. 2 of her so-called enforcers were already in the back of a squad car, faces pale, hands zip-tied. The homeowners who had been moments away from signing their properties away. They were shaking hands with real cops, telling their stories, relieved that someone had finally stopped this. But Victoria? She still thought she could talk her way out. "This is harassment," she shrieked. "I run this neighborhood." Ethan leaned in. "Not anymore, sweetheart." Margaret Ellis, the HOA treasurer, stood off to the side, arms wrapped around herself. Her face was pale, her expression tight. She had backed Victoria for years, helped enforce the ridiculous fees, the fraudulent fines, the property seizures. But now she was realizing that when the ship goes down, it's every rat for themselves. A cop turned to her. "Mrs. Ellis, would you like to come with us voluntarily or—" "Wait," she swallowed, voice shaking. "I didn't know. I mean I knew, but I didn't—" Ethan smirked. "Let me guess. You were just following orders?" Margaret flinched, because she knew exactly where this was going. "Look," she said quickly, "Victoria was the one running things. She handled the fines, the property seizures, everything. I just did the accounting. I never questioned it, I swear." Ethan gave her a slow nod. "Sure, Margaret, that sounds believable. Too bad Judge Prescott already gave us a nice little trail of signatures linking you to half these scams." Her eyes widened. "Wait, Prescott, Ethan turned to Deputy Jessica Hale, who was thumbing through a stack of foreclosure notices. Every single one had Judge Alan Prescott's signature. Every single one was fraudulent. Jessica shook her head. The judge signed off on all of them, without verifying the claims. He knew exactly what he was doing. Another officer muttered, "Well, he's going to need one hell of a lawyer." Ethan smirked. "Hope he invested in a good one." Victoria was no longer screaming. She was just standing there, eyes cold, jaw tight, staring at Ethan like she could set him on fire with a look. He stepped closer, just enough for only her to hear. "You had a good run," she scoffed, voice quiet but sharp. "You think this is over?" Ethan tilted his head. "I think you're about to get very familiar with a federal holding cell." And that's when she whispered it. "I was just following orders." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his gut twisted. "You have no idea who you're up against," she murmured. For the first time since this whole thing started, Victoria looked afraid. And that's what bothered him the most. That night, Ethan got a call from Jessica. "We got a problem." Ethan exhaled. "Let me guess." "Lockwood," Jessica cursed. "Gone. Disappeared before we could even serve him a warrant." Ethan clenched his jaw. Graham Lockwood, the real estate mogul who had been funding Victoria's entire operation, was nowhere to be found. The real game had just begun. The HOA was dead, officially dissolved, funds seized and returned to every homeowner Victoria had scammed. The board? Gone. Prescott? Indicted. And Victoria Langston? She was rotting in a federal holding cell, awaiting trial on enough felony charges to make her next HOA meeting a prison support group. Ethan Graves stood outside a quiet coffee shop, arms crossed, as he watched Jessica Hale hug her parents. For the first time in years, they looked relaxed. "Safe." Jessica turned to him, eyes bright but serious. "You actually did it." Ethan smirked. "Nah, you did. I just kicked the hornet's nest." She let out a breath. "Feels good, though." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it did." When Ethan got home, he knew something was off. Nothing broken, no forced entry, but sitting on his front porch, tucked neatly under a rock, was an unmarked envelope. No postage, no return address. He tore it open, eyes narrowing at the single line typed on crisp white paper. Victoria was disposable. Lockwood isn't. Walk away while you still can. Ethan rolled his tongue against his teeth, staring at the words. Then, slowly, he smiled. Because whoever sent this, they just made a mistake. They thought they could scare him off. They thought this was over. They were wrong. What do you think about this story? Have you ever seen someone get put in their place like this? Where are you watching from? I love seeing how far our community reaches. Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Don't forget to tap the bell icon to stay updated. Your support means the world.